Hi there, we are now going to analyze isolated pawns. Isolated pawns are simply pawns that don't have friendly pawns to defend them. In this position we can see that this pawn on a2 cannot be defended by any pawns because there's no pawns on the b file, no white pawns on the b file. And similarly, the pawn on c4 is isolated because there's no pawns neither on the d file nor on the b file. Black doesn't have any isolated pawn because all of black's pawns can be potentially defended by another black pawn. For example, this pawn a7 is not defended by the b pawn, but after a move like a5, the b pawn would defend the a pawn. So black doesn't have any isolated pawns. And having isolated pawns is very often a weakness. This pawn a2 doesn't look very weak so far because I don't see an easy way for black to attack it. But the pawn on c4 is already being attacked by the rook, and white's rook on c1 is just defending this pawn. And this is the main problem when having an isolated pawn, is that we need to use pieces that are not pawns to defend the pawns. And normally you want to use the rook for something better, for example to attack the king or other pawns, rather than to defend a pawn. And a common strategy when playing against an isolated pawn is to trade pieces in order to reach a position on which the opponent just have a few pieces, a few passive pieces defending the isolated pawn. Let's imagine that we have this position and black manages to exchange most of the pieces, ending up with a rook on each side. We would get a position similar to what we have in front, and here we can already see that black's rook is better than white's rook, so black is already having a clear advantage in this position. Black is simply attacking and white is just defending, having a passive rook on c1. And with that idea in mind, here black played the move bishop to c5. First of all, it plans to exchange the bishop on e7 for a bishop on d4. The bishop on d4 was fairly active, so this is normally a good trade for black. And secondly, here we see another problem of having an isolated pawn, that the square in front of the isolated pawn, in this case e5, is a weak square because it cannot be controlled by any pawn, because here white doesn't have neither a d nor a b pawn. And these squares, if they are advanced, in this case we have the 5th rank, or if it was even further on the opponent's territory, are great to use for our pieces because we have control over them. And this is what we call outposts. And these outposts are normally great for knights. So one idea might be, after exchanging bishops, to bring the knight to c5. Instead of bishop to c5, black could have tried knight to d7, bringing the knight to this outpost. But in this case, white can even give the bishop for the knight, and we also see that this bishop on d4 is fairly active. That's why it makes a lot of sense to try to exchange it first. Let me also mention another move, in case that you thought about it, is to play the move bishop to a3, which seems very aggressive because we attack the rook on c1, but here, after the move rook to c2, although we could argue that a3 is a weak square, the bishop on a3 is not doing anything there. So we can see that c5 is a much better square for black's pieces. So it is very instructive the way that black played, because first of all it occupied a weak square, but also black is planning to exchange pieces, which is normally a good strategy when playing against an isolated pawn. And here white traded, and after rook takes c5, queen to a4 defends the pawn, but black simply increases the pressure after queen to c7. And here white played actively after the move e5, but after knight to d7 we are already attacking this pawn on e5 and this pawn on c4. White played the move f4, but after b5 white is already in trouble because there's a pin on this pawn, so white cannot take because we would simply take on c1. But after queen to a3, black took on c4, and black is already having a much better position, having an extra pawn and the better pieces. While an isolated pawn is very often a weakness, sometimes it can be very useful. In this position, we see that white has an isolated pawn on d4, and although white cannot play d5 easily to get rid of that pawn, remember that we need to evaluate if we have better pieces than our opponent. And here we can see that white has actually very good pieces. This bishop is looking at e6, also this queen, this knight is very strong. So white might sooner or later plan to attack black's king. Black has some very inactive pieces like the rook on a8 and the rook on f8. The isolated pawn is a central pawn, so it controls very important squares like c5 and e5. It is also supporting the knight on e5, so this pawn, as we can see, is very useful. And here we have a lot of pieces, so if black manages to exchange many pieces, black might try to attack the isolated pawn on d4 easily, but in this case the pawn on d4 is actually very well defended, and I don't see an easy way for black to attack it. With that in mind, here black played the move bishop to d5, so here again black is trying to use this outpost on d5, which is normally a great square for black's pieces. But after white took on d5 and black took on d5, black plays this knight on d5, which is again a great outpost for a knight. But white continued playing actively, which is normally the way that you should play when you have an isolated pawn, and play the move f4. And we can now see how white is just planning to activate the rook on f1, which was the worst piece that white had. So now white is planning to play the move f5, putting pressure on e6, and opening the f-file for the rook. So here white's isolated pawn is compensated by his activity, and in fact here white has a better position thanks to having much more active pieces. So isolated pawns are pawns that cannot be defended by other friendly pawns. When playing against them, you can either attack them or use the square in front of them as an outpost for your pieces. And isolated pawns are very often, but not always, a weakness, because they can sometimes help your pieces become more active.